Three models along three axes, three measurable axes. First, the presence of Israeli civilians, settlers. Second, the freedom of action of the IDF. And third, the international presence and international cooperation. In Gaza, you have no Israeli settlers, no freedom of action for the IDF, and since 2007, since the Hamas-led coup, no real international presence. In the northern West Bank, in the district around Jenin, Israel withdrew in 2005 from four settlements, Ganim, Kadim, Sanul, and Homish. There you have today no Israeli settler presence, a full freedom of action for the IDF, which occasionally conducts raids and arrests, and a really interesting international presence and cooperation in terms of training police forces, etc. In the rest of the West Bank, not around Jenin, you have the status quo that existed since 1995, which is a large Israeli civilian presence, a freedom of action for the IDF, expanded somewhat since the Second Intifada, and very little international presence. Three different models: Gaza, northern West Bank, and the rest of the West Bank. If we're going to look at those three and measure the results by any measurement you want, in terms of the intensity of the violence, not in terms of the satisfaction of the political aims of either side, I think that the northern West Bank model has been extremely successful. I should stress, it is not a long-term solution, and it is by no means an answer to the claim, the legitimate claim for self-determination of the Palestinian people. Far from it. Far from it, right? I mean, first of all, the presence of a foreign army, of the IDF, negates that. But for the medium term, it has worked in a way that leaving Gaza completely did not work, and in a way that staying with the massive Israeli civilian presence and the kind of military presence needed to sustain it has not worked. The Jenin district doesn't have has freedom of action for the IDF, like we said. IDF makes arrests of terrorists, breaks up cells. But what it doesn't do is man checkpoints to protect settlements. The average person in Jenin doesn't see a hilltop settlement expand, and doesn't feel his own or her own livelihood threatened in that way. Jenin in 2002 was a byword for suicide bombing. It was the capital of Palestinian terrorism. It was considered the most fanatic place you could imagine. Today it's by far the most peaceful place in the West Bank. So the disengagement, like I said, is two things. It's the Gaza withdrawal and the northern West Bank disengagement. And I think the northern West Bank disengagement has been a big success and a model, again, not necessarily for long term, but a model for how we can proceed, particularly in the absence of any real diplomatic progress. Well, the basic condition for any disengagement is an absence of a bilateral process for a final status. When there's a possibility for a final status agreement, there's no need for disengagement. What makes a final status agreement possible is that the positions of the two sides have a potential overlap. On many of the issues, there is a potential overlap. On statehood, there is. On territory, there is. Borders, that is. On security, there's an imaginable overlap, and lots of progress has been made. On Jerusalem, the sides are close, but I don't think there's a realistic overlap. And on the issue that I politely call mutual recognition, the end of conflict issue, the end of claims issue, I don't think there's any overlap at all. I don't see any real readiness on the Palestinian side for an end of conflict agreement. Particularly on, we left out one major issue, which is refugees, which is part of that. What are called refugees. So the basis of any disengagement is the absence of a bilateral diplomatic track. What was unique in the middle of the last decade were three conditions which I think Israel was able to exploit in the disengagement in 2005. Those conditions were, first, a decisive Israeli military victory. In this case, with the successful end, from Israel's perspective, of the Second Intifada, something nobody thought was possible, including all of the Western military experts in counterinsurgency, all thought the IDF could not do it, that no army could do it. But it did do it. Second was the unusual diplomatic weakness of the Palestinians, and this was definitely the case in 2004, 5, and 6. Arafat was completely isolated at that point and then dead. The new Palestinian government had not yet found its bearings and had not yet made the international alliances that it has since made. And for a variety of international conditions, the Palestinians were briefly very isolated and very weak diplomatically. The last time anything like this was the case was in 1991, after the Persian Gulf War. And then too, Israel tried to take advantage of that to make bold diplomatic steps. And the third condition was a very tight coordination between Washington and Jerusalem, which was also the case from about 2004 till really about 2008. We forget how much the Bush administration and the Sharon government did not get along in the first years that they were both in power. And even when they did get along, there wasn't the intimate level of coordination that they later had after about 2004. But briefly, there was a very tight coordination. Those three things, the aftermath of decisive Israeli military victory, an unusual weakness diplomatically of the Palestinian side, and a very tight coordination between Jerusalem and Washington are what made the disengagement possible. None of those three things obtained today. Israel has emerged from several rounds of, it has managed to hold on to the relative peace that it obtained at the end of the Second Intifada in the West Bank, in the face of all the predictions, including my own, for over a decade now, which is impressive. It has also managed to stay out of all of the inter-Arab violence since 2011, which I think is even more impressive. But it has not emerged from any of the conflicts in southern Lebanon or the Gaza Strip with a decisive victory the way it did at the end of Operation Defensive Shield and other operations in 2002, 2003 in the West Bank. Nor has it managed to provide a definitive military response to the smaller but troubling threats of violence coming from the West Bank and Jerusalem, and I can't imagine that it will. So that effect is missing. Today, the Palestinian Authority, ironically, I think, due to the division, the geographical division between the West Bank and Gaza, is much stronger diplomatically than it was in the dying days of Arafat and the first days of Mahmoud Abbas. That's because the division has removed a lot of radical pressure on the Palestinian Authority, so that the Ramallah regime is actually perceived as much more moderate than the Palestinian public or cause taken as a whole in all the occupied territories, and certainly in the Palestinian diaspora community, is perceived. And not only is it able to then maneuver better internationally, but the Israeli government is much more isolated diplomatically because of enormous international frustration on the settlement issue. So the second of those three issues looks completely different than it did in 2005. And the third is the Israeli-United States relationship, which for its own reasons looks very different than it did in 2005. Without those three things, I think a disengagement is very difficult. And yet, without a realistic bilateral option, I think a disengagement is necessary. Ideally, Israel needs to improve its position on all three of those dimensions that I've listed above. So, starting with the last one, it needs to put itself in a position of much closer coordination with the United States. One of the things that made one of the major shifts in the way Prime Minister Sharon governed himself was his ability to do things that he really didn't like, or that were very unpopular, or that were very difficult with his cabinet, because he wanted to satisfy Washington. He was unable to do that in the first 2 years of his, when he actually had a much more moderate government. Remember, in the first 2 years he had the Labour Party as his senior partner. And you see that from about 2003, his entire orientation changes. He stops military operations halfway when the US demands. He makes steps that he personally opposes very much, just to maintain that coordination. I'm not sure that's going to be possible until January 2017. If it is, I'd like to see it before, and if not, we'll have to wait till January 2017. In terms of addressing the relative diplomatic strength of the Palestinian Authority right now, and the commensurate weakness of Israel diplomatically, there are many steps that can be done there too. I think there are steps that Israel can take to neutralize the settlement issue. Perhaps with another unilateral building freeze, perhaps with a freeze just beyond the fence. I think there are steps Israel can take to weaken the Palestinian side diplomatically as well. Although again, it's not the easiest thing. Some of it's structural. Arafat's gone, and Arafat made so many crucial mistakes from 2002 to 2004 that just the same way he did in 1990-91, it was in those two situations we were able to take advantage of his mistakes. We face a different set of circumstances now. And in terms of the first one, I hope we can avoid another Gaza war, or another war in southern Lebanon, or any other surprise. We tend to always predict a repeat of the things that happened in the past, but every war Israel's ever had has always been inevitable in retrospect, and a surprise on the day it broke out. But obviously, the next confrontation, hopefully results in as decisive an Israeli victory as possible.